Before we get into the new material in this week's lecture, I wanted to take a short segment to simply review some of the concepts that have been introduced in this course. At this point, we have introduced most of the key explanatory concepts and identification concepts that we're going to be using to go through cases. So I just want to sort of try to put it all into a larger framework so that we can start making sense of some of the things we've talked about in earlier weeks. So as I mentioned on the first day, one of the primary learning outcomes of the course is basically, you can think of it as sense making, or we need to be able to identify features and conditions of situations, of the situations that exist in the cases that we're looking at, and try to have some sense of what the implications of these conditions are. So again, we had the 3 weeks where we looked at establishment, enterprise, and transition features and conditions. So just to give you an example here, what I'm talking about is, so on week 2, we talked a lot about work processes or work functions, and we started to identify ways that we could identify these features. So for example, we can, in essence, chart the work processes themselves. We can break them down into work functions, so you can identify the key and core work functions, core business processes, non-core business processes. In addition, there's some sort of features / mechanisms like demand-driven activity. And so we know that if you encounter demand-driven activity, you're going to tend to have certain symptoms of it, like people that are working too much some of the time, not enough the other time, and they might have a sense of loss of control. Duplicated steps, we know that tends to impede efficiency. When you have a cross-functional work process, you typically sort of move over into some sort of establishment type conditions like dotted lines or two bosses, but to simply identify that there is a cross-functional work process itself sort of leads you to be on the lookout for the way that might affect how work proceeds in this cross-functional work process, and also what types of features might help you better control and coordinate activity in the cross-functional work process. The issue of control in general, we looked at direct and indirect control over outcomes. So this was basically who gets to actually have a say. So for example, in the junta, we thought, well, there are things that are outside of our line of authority. The librarian, things outside of the line of authority. And so understanding the work process and who gets to make final decisions will sometimes tell you not just who might be called the boss or not, but for example, in the case with that we just did last week with NIOSH, we know that Anita Schell was able to insert her authority into the DDRC process itself to show, in essence, give her some strategic control over research by being able to review the cases and being able to sort of make suggestions about the scientific direction of the papers that are going to be written as part of the DDRC. Another concept that we haven't talked about as much, but which I would like to draw your attention to, is the idea that in some cases we have these gray areas of authority. So we'll be talking about that more in the week on organizational mistakes, but that sometimes it's not clear who makes a final decision or who makes a final call. And again, once we have identified these gray areas, often due to changes in environmental contingencies or just badly designed organizations, we know that they're going to cause certain characteristic issues, like things tend to slip through the cracks, things don't get done that need to get done. In week 3, we looked more at establishment features and conditions. So this was all things associated with roles and reporting lines. Though we did look at organizational types of Mintzberg, and one of the nice ways that we can use Mintzberg is once you have identified, say, an organizational, not just a type, but we also thought about the match between organizational parts and organizational control. So when you see a technostructure, you know that the sort of type of control that if there's a true technostructure and it needs to exert its authority, it will often use things where, for example, it designs and controls work processes. Whereas if you see more of a divisionalized form with middle managers in charge, you know they're going to need to be sort of measuring performance more, or that's the control mechanism that gets associated more with these different establishment types. We know that with the brokerage role, it will often be the case, right? This is someone who stands in between two audiences that are otherwise disconnected, and that has both power and some peril associated with it. We know that sometimes you can't just look at the formal reporting lines, but you need to look at both formal and informal interaction patterns. So by going back and look at enterprise or other things. And so we can basically identify areas where you might have conflicts, where you have unclear or even ambivalent authority, where some people have authority over some situations and some people have it over others. The same type of issue with relative standing or status ambiguity, again, establishment concepts. We might think about things like, too, like the composition of committees, so either the balance of power or who's getting interests are getting represented and whose aren't. Finally, in week 4, we looked at transition-related features, so things that are associated with episodes, events, and cycles. We talked some about activity along the interface or active monitoring. So again, in the case of NIOSH, we needed to see more being able to basically figure out who was getting the work done and who wasn't on the DDRC process because of this sort of incomplete authority, which is a dotted line problem. We talked a lot about the sort of resistance, interference, and backlash, which are both basically events that occur between a process, so they're process features, but also there are mechanisms. They can be a shorthand for mechanisms that exist within a transition. Talk about small wins, commitment, and actor certification. So again, these are all both process features, but they also can be a shorthand for mechanisms, sort of referring to things like commitment. Well, commitment, a first commitment, but within small wins, you often get increased commitment or changes in perceptions and other underlying mechanisms. So that's not a complete list, but it gives us at least some sense of how we're going to try to think that, okay, part of the reason that we identify things is because it helps us make sense of situations. So we're going to want to try to identify aspects of future cases as much as possible, continuing to use the language that we have been going through in the first few weeks. And part of what we do in later weeks is we continue to both practice using those earlier concepts, and we also get introduced to more mechanisms. And the reason mechanisms are so important, sort of how features basically result in some set of outcome conditions in a more or less predictable way, is because otherwise it's very difficult to use your judgment about what's wrong in a situation, and also how you can outline potential options for sort of solving a set of clearly defined goals, or at the very least, we can say reaching a set of desired outcome conditions and evaluating the ramifications or implications of these different options. So basically, if we think about analysis as both being part of sense-making and judgment steps, that analysis depends a lot on understanding how the things that we identify, like dotted lines or clogs, or, basically unclear authority in an authorizing environment, end up having an effect on people, like it increases the chance of resistance, or if the case of monitoring, it decreases the chance of resistance. So how do we go about doing that? The general form of our answers, as it is really in any class that you take where you engage in an explanation, is you point to something out there, some factor X. In this case, it's going to tend to be features, either design features or process features of the establishment, enterprise, or transition. There's going to be some sort of mechanism that will often, though we'll be looking a little bit here at cases where they don't, but last week we talked mostly about ones that involve individual or behavioral decision making. Today, part of what we're going to be talking about some is social mechanisms. But again, these are sort of mechanisms that basically explain why people do what they do, but we don't have to talk about them as being purely rational. So I'm trying to introduce you to some different ways of thinking about what types of features affect individual behavior. And then the end result is going to be some set of outcome conditions. So we can think about, okay, when you have a dotted line, you end up with role ambiguity. The role ambiguity at the lower level basically it translates into a sense of increased threat, a decreased sense of power, and therefore you tend to get sort of the deer frozen in headlights, and people don't tend to do what they're told to do because they're getting conflicting messages. So that is, again, very much the general form of an answer that we talked about, in particular in previous week 4. But just to remind you then that each of these conditions that we might think about and how they work, and I'm not going to go into these in great detail. These aren't really even necessarily complete because, again, anytime you sit down and you want to write something, part of what you're going to have to do is spend a bit more time. You'll use some of these terms because they form a shorthand that we all agree on what they mean, but you're also going to want to describe what it exactly means by demand-driven activity and how it is that it works to sort of bring about some sense of loss of control or decrease in sense of personal power, maybe give an example or two, but that then results in decreased activity. Or when you have a cross-functional work process, it tends to produce role ambiguity or threat. Again, that's going to tend to result in people not doing what they're supposed to do, in essence. On the other hand, when you have something like unity of command, you aren't getting these conflicting messages. People are going to tend to sort of fall in line and do what they're asked to do much more because the messages they're getting are consistent. So you have reduction in role ambiguity. There are some nice earlier slides in particular on unity of command and two bosses or dotted line problem, including references to where you can go and look in the articles. These are the green slides from week 3 that probably now you're more in a better shape to read them, and you'll find those understanding of those mechanisms increasingly important in future weeks. We know that in general, when there's, for example, relative standing, sort of conflicts about relative standing or status ambiguity, when it's not so clear as in the case of Michigan, on the one hand, probably the food and the utilities departments are probably most important in terms of student satisfaction, but that those people are from a lower class background, the people from residential life are a higher class background. In addition, they have more contact with university hierarchies. In essence, what you have is some sense in which there is status ambiguity. Who is higher status? Is it the people the students care about more, or is it the people the administration care about more? Is it the person who has the higher education or the lower education, or the people who meet with more influential outside vendors? Every time you see that type of ambiguity about who's actually, you don't see reinforcing layers of status where the same person who's high on one dimension is high on another, but you instead are going to tend to see conflict because it's not clear who should win an argument, at least without some sort of third-party adjudicator. With the transition conditions, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those because, again, you can go back to the lecture where I go through in detail these different types of mechanisms and how features out in the world sort of correspond to the underlying mechanisms of things like small win and commitment. Because in essence, in the transition, because we're talking about motion, the feature and the mechanism are typically referred to, or in this class I've chosen to have you refer to them as using the same type of terminology. Though there are better ways, and I give some examples of that in the case in the previous lectures of how you actually refer to more concretely to the features of interest. So again, this was simply a short review. Hopefully, though, it helps you go back and put some of the earlier work in context and gives you a nice foundation on which we can build our future knowledge and future weeks understandings of in-case analysis.